Sitting across from the toy doll that plagued my life, I realized that I cannot do this anymore. The running, the hiding, my life tormented by such a little fucking brat, something that I should have done long ago. I pointed the gun that fell into my hands first towards the roof of my mouth and then at its forehead, looking into its beady eyes. I wondered how things go to this, the insanity that led me to this cabin, to this man, and how this thing wasn't even my tormentor, but more the physical representation of everything. As my hand held the trigger I cried, I dropped the gun, and I slumped over crying to myself. When I was 4 my grandmother bought me the doll, a little man whose eyes comprised of black beads. Looking back at it, the toy was pretty disturbing. A small man in a WW1 era officer uniform that had no mouth and just some black beads for eyes. Blank expression with endless fields of horror and death. I loved him. His name was Jack, and he soon became my best friend. We would sail the seas, fight in many wars, broker peace between the teddies and the action figures. Jack and I were inseparable even when we grew older. Entering into prep I had brought him with me, and still we were inseparable. At lunch we would enter the sand pit and think about fighting in some far place like Alice Springs. But of course being in a school environment, especially as the weird kid who played with his toy more than other kids, I was bullied relentlessly. Jack never sprang up to my defense. He wouldn't order a charge, he just sat there as the kids picked on me. It was so bad that eventually I left Jack home, and then I left him home the next day and the next and the next and the next. Jack was left at home permanently, and soon he was relegated to supporting me at home and not at the front lines of this war. After a few weeks I did manage to make a friend, well a few, but one really good friend, and that was Quinn. She was one of the first people I started talking to, and she was amazing. We were 2 imaginative kids, and whilst I had Jack, she had a doll named Sherlyn. Sherlyn was this Barbie doll who had an aviator outfit. Sherlyn and Jack became best friends as Quinn and I did. She would start coming over to my place, and we would imagine Jack and Sherlyn flying through the sky. Given Jack would drop bombs on the enemy teddies below, supporting an invasion by the action figures. Quinn is probably still the coolest girl I've ever known. Growing up together we were teased for being boyfriend and girlfriend by the other kids. As I grew older, I realized how pretty Quinn was, and our hanging out decreased from Sherlyn and Jack, and more about her and Jack eventually fell onto my shelf and stayed there. Quinn and I were inseparable now, with us going from imaginative exploration to actual exploration. Making a base with a small tent in the middle of the woods under a cliff, we would spend every weekend there building it up whilst exploring the depths of those forests. It was a cool August day and Quinn was building a homemade bow that we both knew would never actually work other than as a cool decoration. When we heard a loud crunch outside our base, we looked into each other's eyes thinking that my mum was outside going to tell us that food was ready, but no, I didn't hear mum or see her. "Mum will be up in a second," is what I yelled out, expecting a response. "Mum? Are you there?" was what naturally followed after several seconds of not hearing her. Quinn and I stood, confused, as we were sure we heard something walking outside our base, and Mum was the only one who knew where it was. We heard several massive crunches under heavy footsteps, as if this thing was searching for something. Knowing this thing to be too big to be Mum or anyone we knew, Quinn had grabbed my arm, looking at me in a scared tone. To show I was the big guy who could defend her, I made sure to muffle the sounds of me sobbing. I was shaking, and she was too. We had no idea who this person was or what they were doing, but the fact they were searching for something, and being 9-year-olds we both were too imaginative from the stories of stranger danger. I had always thought, if I was Daniel Morcombe I would have been not dumb enough to get into that situation, or I would have been able to fight back. And now hearing something literally right outside our base, our tent, I was stricken by the need to run, to hide, to cry, but I couldn't do anything but stand still, hoping for this nightmare to end. As if it couldn't get any worse, as if this nightmare couldn't get any worse, the figure was right outside the tent. Quinn was mute whilst I started loudly crying. I had no idea what to do, I didn't want to, and I knew Quinn seen me as weak, but I couldn't hold back. Then the tent started to shake. It started to shake as the thing pulled and pushed against the tent side, and I let out a scream. "Please leave us alone. Please. I'm sorry if we did anything to your place. Please just let us leave," is what was let out of my voice, the scream I let out to the monster outside the tent. The monster stopped, it walked away, and with that Quinn in a tone of pure fear stated, "Jacob, we need to go home." I had no issue with this, but right as I was about to step out and run, something hit the side of the tent, not like a big hit, but as a small thud. With everything in me, I undid the tent zip and looked outside. Jack looked up at me, his beady eyes looked up at me from the ground, positioned as if he knew I was going to step out. I jumped back, not knowing how to react, when I felt Quinn grab my hand hard and ran out the door, tugging me along. We ran up the hill, then down into the ditch, past the massive tree and through the battlefield. She held my hand, dragging me until we heard the footsteps running behind us. It was then she let go and we both ran next to each other. I had been the slower one, so I watched her run far ahead of me. Focusing on her, I didn't notice the rock, and I tripped over it, smashing my head against a tree. Waking in the hospital, I screamed my mum's name over and over until she was hugging me, saying everything was okay, that I was fine. A doctor, some nurses and 2 police officers walked over to me. The doctor was checking for any amnesia, and the police officers wanted me to tell them what had happened. I had to tell them all about the thing, how Jack appeared, how it chased us. Quinn had been questioned too, but with her parents telling her she was never allowed into the woods again. I was told the same, and that when we hang out, we aren't allowed to leave the house as it's far too dangerous for us. I was just glad that I got to see Mum again, that she could hug me, and that everything was alright. For the weeks that followed, Mum was constantly checking the forest, she was checking the windows, and she made sure to constantly check the locks. The fact that Jack was there when I explained I didn't have him, when Quinn said we didn't have him, made Mum anxious, extremely anxious. The whole town was hearing about a house being broken into and a thing chasing kids. It wasn't until a few weeks I asked her how they found me, to which she didn't want to answer. She just told me that they did because Quinn had shown them, but I knew that wasn't the full truth. She was looking away and going back on herself. I at the time accepted this answer, but 19-year-old me didn't, and when I practically yelled at her to tell me the truth that had happened a decade ago, I finally got the answer. Quinn had heard me fall and screamed. She looked back to see a man towering over me. The man grabbed me and ran back into the woods. She tried to follow him to see what he did, and she seen him take me back to the base, but as she was watching she seen him look at her, and so she ran all the way back, avoiding the rock, running through the backyard, screaming at my mum that a man had taken me, that I was in danger, and that she needed to go and save me. My mum had grabbed the phone and barely able to talk, she blurted everything Quinn had said. Within 10 minutes my mum, the police, Quinn's parents, and the neighbors all were in the forest searching for me. It was down at the base they found me, slumped over a little girl's table having a tea party. The other seat was empty, and, on the table, opposite me was a note that read "Seat reserved for Jack." Back at the house, just to top it off, where Jack was last left before being found outside our tent, was another note that was inscribed with "Sorry, I just wanted to play." There was a massive search, but nothing was ever found. Nothing had happened to me, thankfully, but this was just the start of Jack ruining my life.